Hello and welcome to another episode of Fintech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today I am utterly delighted to be joined all the way from Israel by Avi Cohen, CEO and co-founder of The Floor. Avi, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me today, Toby.
Oh, it's great to have you
on.
on.
Greetings from Tel Aviv.
It looks like, I'm just trying to look behind you there. It looks like it's a bit of sunshine out there.
It's actually a lot of construction at the background, so it's good that the sun is hiding everything.
Well, that's what I'm hearing about Tel Aviv. There's always a bit of construction going on. It's at the forefront of innovation, that place at the moment. So good to hear from you. Look, there's a lot of exciting stuff that I want to talk through in this, but for people who haven't necessarily heard too much about you or the Floor so far, can you give us a brief insight into the business, please?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, we're a fintech company. We're set up in 2016. And from day one, we're working with the incumbents. So we're helping tier one banks to innovate, to move time to market much faster by bringing innovation into the organization. And simply put, to solve problems in basically every business line. We haven't encountered any problem in the banking industry that we haven't been able to solve. And gradually, since 2016, we've been evolving this methodology, this data, this expertise together with the bank into a platform, into a SaaS platform that enables basically any bank in the world to access our platform, to get the problem statements and the needs to be solved through technologies, and to take them through the entire process of evaluating a solution all the way until when it's implemented inside the bank, and it's a significant impact across banks in order to move much faster with innovation, as we all know, especially today.
And I think Israel and innovation in fintech have sort of become synonymous over the last couple of years. There's been so many success stories about what you guys have been doing out there. And I think it seems to me to be one of the fastest growing areas of global fintech, the global fintech scene at the moment. Why is that? Why so much good stuff coming out of Israel right now, and Tel Aviv in particular?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look back maybe 9 years ago, Israel was only most for cybersecurity. That's like our bread and butter. This is where we came out first. But I think gradually, those were the years, post 2008, banks were looking outside of their home countries to go for innovation. Silicon Valley was probably the main geography in the beginning. And then gradually, there was like one of the banks who told us there was a small heaven of innovation in the Middle East that gradually became a very interesting destination for banks to consume innovation. And all of a sudden, it wasn't about just cybersecurity. Obviously, cybersecurity and the different subsets of cybersecurity still remain the main innovation hub for banks around fraud prevention, financial crime, different types of IT security, and so forth. But all of a sudden, you saw a lot of Israeli entrepreneurs, including ourselves, jumping from that cybersecurity domain and specifically into more of like financial services, and looking how you can bring AI and different type of digital capabilities into the banking industry. And you gradually saw more and more companies dealing with the lending space, dealing with AI and analytics, jumping more towards into areas that weren't I would say the more convenient areas of banks and Israeli entrepreneurs before. And that gradually changed. And I think that, over the course of the last 9 years, we've seen a lot of success stories. One of them, being IPOs just recently with Lemonade as an Israeli success story in the US. But, it's 3 entrepreneurs, have zero background in insurance, created one of the most impressive insurance companies in the last couple of years. And I think that shows a lot about kind of the Israeli spirit, is taking areas that we're not usually accustomed to, not to mention the fact that, Israel is not a financial capital, right? Most Israelis, if you ask them, have, little to know about banking, probably much less than in the UK and the US. But I think that we kind of overcome that knowledge gap by bringing the technology and partnering with the right players in order to create real innovation in fintech.
Yeah, I think that sort of depth of deep tech talent is certainly at the kernel of everything that I've been seeing from it. And you mentioned there that this is a really exciting time right now, because look, if there's one area that's sort of been ripe for increased innovation, it's been the banking world. And as you say, you haven't come across a problem that you haven't been able to help with over the the years that you've been trading so far. Tell us a little bit about how digital innovation in banks has gone from just being a nice to have to an absolute must have. What's happening there?
I think, from my perspective, COVID-19 is probably the fastest catalyst that I've seen in digital transformation for years. There's definitely an impact of before and after. So it's not to say that banks haven't been investing a lot in transformation and digital banking before COVID-19, but I think once the customers reacted accordingly, then you've seen larger numbers of usage in digital banking. You look at banks have apps on Google Store and app stores in the last couple of months. They've more than doubled. And people don't want to go to branches anymore, so they just call the call centers or they go online to the bank's website. And these are people that were not tech savvy. These parents, grandparents that can't go to the bank branch anymore, and they need to get accustomed to digital banking. And the younger generation, which don't even know what a branch looks like, but had to go into doing much of their banking online and use their and change their their habits in terms of consuming banking and financial services. So I think that once banks have identified this, they needed to put much more effort and resources on building a robust and a resilient infrastructure that can accommodate to those needs. And we've seen this across the globe, either launching new digital offerings, especially, by the way, with SMEs. Banks that weren't able to provide SMEs lending without going into the branch, all of a sudden can communicate with an SME strictly online and provided that loan end-to-end in a matter of days. And that's a significant change and transformation for a lot of financial institutions that all of a sudden see not only the need, but it's like zero chances to make any mistakes in that perspective, because you have to deliver financial services. You, as an SME that needs financial support, or as a retail client that is of need of financial support, you can't wait months and months to receive that support from a financial institution. It needs to happen tomorrow or the day after, the latest. But things are changing from the customer perspective, and I think that's pushing a lot of the banks to do much more on building their digital proposition. And a lot of the time there's the question of how do they fit up against the challenger banks. I know in the UK it's a hot topic. Everyone is comparing. Challenger banks have always been online. And I think banks, to some extent, have always been online as well, but they've had that legacy behind them of, a massive physical operation, massive organization. And you look at banks right now, even from the back office, right? Banks are moving their entire staff behind the scenes, working from home. You have 200,000 people working from home in one organization. You need to become agile. You need to become, to some extent, like a tech company, right? And banks have always wanted to be that Amazon-like bank, or kind of being the same type of tech mentality. And I think that working from home has pushed them to become much more digital, and as a result kind of creating that ripple effect of providing the same level of services for the clients. I think it created a type of kind of an end-to-end outlook for banks that are looking at providing services in the new era, which is kind of zero interaction with customers, but maximum value.
And this has been so much the driver of this user demand, right? And it's pushed people into a completely new paradigm in terms of where it goes. And you say 200,000 people working from home. What do you think the legacy will be in some of these organisations? Do you think there will be, when we were talking beforehand, we're hearing news today of vaccine breakthroughs, and in the UK, every single headline in today's paper is about a vaccine by Christmas and such like. Whether we're quite at that stage or not is a different matter, but at some stage over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, we will see a return to a more normalised world again, right? That's almost certain. What will the legacy be of that? And do you think banks will make the most of this opportunity to really innovate and take a leaf out of some of the challenger stories? And what will the legacy be of that to the challenger banks themselves when they're dealing with more digitally orientated businesses. About 15
Yeah, I
questions
think
for you there to deal with.
I think it's interesting because, I compare it. Someone told me the other day that in his view, people will just go back to normal after the vaccine is ready. People will say, okay, what's done is done. That was in the past. Our life can go back to normal. We have a vaccine now. We're immune. But I actually think that, yes, maybe some behaviors will come back. But, if you look at banking, I think it was the best excuse that any CIO or any CDO or head of innovation could have asked for.
Yeah.
That it's the perfect excuse to completely change the bank and the way that the bank is running. And it doesn't matter in which geography you are today, because everyone is impacted by COVID-19. So I think that a lot is going to change, after COVID. And I think it's for the best because, maybe a bank doesn't need a branch, and, maybe a bank can have less people, but be more efficient. And maybe the proposition can become much more similar to a tech company. How many times have you spoken to Google? How many times have you spoken to Amazon? Unless you need something specifically from them or you need a service from them. So I think that becoming more agile, becoming more efficient is something that is going to be accelerated within banks. But again, we have to bear in mind that these organizations are still managing our money. They're still managing our funds. They're heavily regulated. So the efforts that they're investing in delivering financial services are much different than the tech companies and the lack of regulatory burden that some of those organizations have. So I think banks will need to manage the balance in going into that new era, but while still keeping and adhering to the regulation and to the policies that they need to in order to deliver financial services. And at the same time, you're seeing, even before COVID-19, we see a lot of banks that have launched, new digital banks that have launched new offering. 2020 has always been about the year of platforms, right? 2 years ago it was all about, blockchain and fintech, and 2020 is all about platforms. You need to have platforms that are segmented to the different business lines and to the different audience that you deal. You have a bank for students, you have a brand for SMEs, you have a brand for underbanked audiences or customers. So I think you're seeing this agenda being accelerated only after COVID-19, is that the bank is reimagining banking. And I think to some extent you'll see, we're talking about the bank of the future. I think you'll see banks going probably into non-banking areas as well. I mean, if Google and Amazon can do that, why can bank go as well? So maybe, and I think COVID-19 has really proven it, is that, if you look at 2008, banks were the problem, right? But if you look at, 2020, banks are actually part of the solution. And it's not just about delivering financial services. It's about, helping, people manage COVID-19. If they need health services, or if they need just, way more beyond just financial services. It could be also around having, support with, medical products. We've seen some of the banks shipping hundreds and thousands of masks to their local customers. So you see banks are gradually going into areas that are not specifically restricted just for financial services, but actually also how to, manage your real estate. We've seen some examples in some of the Asian countries in which banks are offering also marketplaces for real estate and marketplaces for medical services. And you see, obviously, insurance and others, but also a lot of areas like e-commerce. All of a sudden, the banks can sit in the center of your life, not only for financial services, but for advice for anything that you may need. And I think that over time, you'll see more and more banks are either building these types of propositions through partnerships. So we've seen that in the US, with Amazon collaborating with some of the American banks, but we might see the other way around. We might see banks collaborating with different brands in order to provide a new offering that goes beyond just the normal financial services.
I think there's a very interesting piece that you're talking about here, because you mentioned e-commerce, and for many years we've been talking with a group that we sort of chair called the Fintech Influencers about the pure amount of catch up that the financial markets need to do with the e-commerce world, and how how many lessons there are to transport away from that. And effectively what you've been talking about is exactly what's made Amazon and Google so strong, is the personalization, isn't it? Everything that's facilitated the extraordinary growth of those two businesses has been around personalization of service to each individual. And we've got very used to that as a consumer. We've got very used to having everything laid out on a plate, completely tailored to our wants and desires. And I think banking has been particularly slow at sort of following that lead and recognizing that every individual client, punter, whatever you want to call them, has got a very different sort of set of needs. And I think this is where technology can really help to personalize that and give people real value from their banking service. And I guess that's exactly what you're doing, right, as well, and facilitating that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that the only reason why banks were lagging behind is a question around data, right? I mean, if you look at data science capabilities in the tech companies, they've just been a huge collector of data, and that basically led to expertise around leveraging that data for personalization. But I think banks have been catching up. Some of the smartest people I know in data science are actually working for banks. And they're doing massive things. And I think banks, to some extent, have much richer and quality data than some of the e-commerce platform, because the e-commerce platform covers some aspect of your life as a consumer, while a bank have much more dimension of your data in other areas as well. So the picture that can have for a bank around a specific client is much more complete than you would see in other platforms, which can only rely on one dimension or two dimensions that they may have on different customers. So I think that banks have been catching up in terms of creating that personalization capabilities. We actually have a lot of strong technologies like that in Israel that, taking the next generation of PFM, personal finance management technologies, to the next level, and creating that holistic approach to look at every client in a much broader way into other areas that the banks didn't usually used to go into before. So I think that to some extent, we've seen that catch-up effect in banks, and I think it's only going to get stronger, because as much as the online presence of banks is becoming more increased, it means that the data is becoming more and more meaningful, and they can flip it back in order to provide better financial services.
You've touched on it a couple of times now with regards to the sort of stranglehold of regulation, particularly around some of the sort of larger institutions. How does regulation stop, for want of a better expression, strangling the industry, and how do we utilize regulation to provide that personalized, detailed, valuable service which everyone wants from a bank, but have been frustrated about for maybe the last couple of decades?
It's interesting, because to some extent we've always seen banking as sort of like a triangle, right? You have IT, you have the technology, you have regulation, and you have the business, and it's kind of like a constant tension that continues to operate and to live inside banking. And sometimes, the regulation is pushing the business behind, and the technology is impacted by the business, because, everyone is basically relying on each other, but the regulation has always been the strongest component, right? You can build the best proposition, Google-like application, but if the compliance doesn't approve it, then there's nothing much that you can do, right? The bank will never take the risk of launching a product that hasn't been vetted and approved by the regulation or by the compliance teams. So I actually think that regulation, to some extent, is quite similar to COVID-19. I think that every time we've had in the last couple of years a new regulation, we've seen how it accelerated innovation and the adoption of banks to a certain regulation. You've seen that with PSD2, or we've seen that with PSD2. You've seen it with GDPR, right? All of a sudden, privacy and data is becoming so important that a bank needs to know at any given point which data they have about a particular customer, how that data is transitioned across geographies, and how can you delete that data without jeopardizing customer privacy. How do you move into the cloud, right? Banks were, discovering the cloud as a more efficient and cost-effective proposition, but how do you move customer data into the cloud? So at the same time, there's a lot of phenomena and a lot of shifts in banking that occurred because of regulation. And I think it really resembled to what we're seeing with COVID-19. It's like, yes, it's true that banks to some extent are reactive, but at the same time, they've been working a lot in order to mitigate that. And if you have to remember, the regulation, it's not a static phenomenon, right? Regulation can happen, updates to regulation can happen, on a daily basis. And banks have to adapt quickly every time there's a new update to a regulation or every time there's a new regulation coming out. But I think it's a strong component that pushes the bank to become more innovative and to react to that. Even with PSD2, we've seen there was a lot of question about are banks going to lose the end customer relationship because there might be a middleman that's going to come in between and use the relationship with the customer going forward and keeping the bank as dumb pipes behind the scenes. But actually, I think banks have reacted really nice to it. They said, okay, there are going to be some new players coming in. Why don't we just set up our own type of digital offerings and compete with those players at the same time? But I think all in all, banks have something that I think that will remain stronger than anything going forward, and that's the customer trust. I think that people still trust banks. They might have different views, but I think because of regulation, because of compliance, because that as a customer, as a client, that banks have to adhere to a certain set of rules that are usually global, then you have the highest trust in the organization. And I think that if you can maintain that trust while continue building the best digital offering that you can for a client, you'll see banks keeping their role in the ecosystem going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's refreshing to hear someone talking positively about it as well, because I do think there's been it's very easy to jump on the bandwagon of the sort of monolithic dinosaur of the banking sector, but we are saying, look, I think in the capital markets for many years we sort of the race to the lowest possible latencies, the race to zero latency being the sort of trading advantage. Right now, I think there's an absolute innovation race, and people there. You mentioned the sort of collaboration with fintechs, and rather than saying, right, okay, I think probably between 5 and 10 years ago, it was right. Let's stamp out this upstart fintech movement, and then very quickly it turned from right. This is a real thing. Let's see how we can collaborate. And to me, the banks that have reached out the best and sort of really paved the way for that innovation to be and partnering to allow companies to sort of work with them have certainly prospered. And I think there's businesses that Lloyd's spring to mind straight away, Citigroup I think spring to mind straight away, Barclays with everything that's happened with Rise. There's been some standout examples of banks there to me that have accepted this change and really embraced it, and the race for innovation I think is going to be a really fascinating thing to look at over the coming weeks, the coming months even. I'm keen to look as well about what's happening on a macro scale. We were speaking. I sort of started the conversation with you this afternoon by saying how impressed I'd been with Israel's response to it and how the numbers had all been pretty good. You've corrected me with a little bit of a second wave. Now, Israel, I think, has been ahead. It opened back up quite quickly. It's probably a month or so ahead of us in the UK at the moment. Describe the scene a little bit for what's happening out there and how the sort of opening back up of offices has been and what you're seeing at the moment, if you would.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to compare the two periods, because if you look back in March, we actually here at the Flow, we anticipated what was about to happen, so we sent everyone to work from home 2 weeks before the quarantine. And then for us, it was kind of an interesting experiment. Productivity. I know everyone say productivity is the best, and I actually support that. And I think that after a month and a half of quarantine, people were actually getting ready to go back to the office. I mean, it was pretty obvious that people want to go back, putting the kids back to schools and getting back to routine. And I think that it may have been too fast. I think that putting the back to routine across Israel has happened a bit too accelerated, in which that the infrastructure to support, a massive amount of people going back to offices, going back to the streets, going back to restaurants and coffee places and so forth, has enforced, in a way, the return of the pandemic without people being able to even spot it, in a sense. And you've seen the numbers going up in the last couple of weeks to even highest numbers than we've had in the first wave. And I think it also, to some extent, you've also see quite the differences between Israel and other countries. So while we had relatively okay first wave, we've managed to keep the numbers low. Mortality rates were very low as well. But when you look at how Israelis react to social distancing, I would say that there's still much to learn from other countries. I think that it could be also a cultural thing. I think that, Israelis are not accustomed to social distancing. We're a very warm and open society. And I think that, I travel a lot to Asia, especially to Hong Kong, because we have, I used to travel before the pandemic, but I was always amazed that you would walk in the summer in Hong Kong and you would see people going with masks. And I never understood it, right? I never understood why would someone in the middle of the summer would go with a mask. And in Israel, it's something that is very hard to comprehend. Usually in Israeli summers, when you can go all the way up to 40 degrees in July and August. And I think part of the reason is that people are just not used to the new rules that have been forced by COVID-19. And I think that, to some extent, we need to consider a type of a restart to this back to routine environment at the moment, in which we either will have to manage kind of a semi-quarantine life, or we'll have to just be more accustomed to managing ourselves on a day-to-day basis while keeping distance from other people and making sure that we're not enforcing ourselves even a third wave. But like we discussed earlier, I don't think that until we have a vaccine, I think we're just gonna see waves like that across the globe. And at some point it will be Israel, and another point it will be another country. And I just think that we will have to manage this on the good side, hopefully, until it's resolved.
So as a business owner who's pivoted ahead of the curve, and I guess having a Hong Kong office, you saw the severity of it a little bit more than many people further westward. As a business owner who quickly got people out and was acting ahead of everything there, with regards to this sort of second wave, or potential second wave, and potential, if there's another quarantine or whatever, how does that change what you're doing at the moment? How are you reacting to that in your business, and what are you preparing for?
Yeah, I mean, I think like as a tech company, I think that you're agile by nature, right? And especially in Israel, because it's a small market, then you go global from day one. There is no point in trying to take over the Israeli market. Usually Israelis would try to take over the US, Europe, today even more in Asia. So we've always been built to go global. That's why we have global teams. And I think because of the fact that our offering sits on the cloud, and basically every bank can access our platform in order to access technologies and to drive digital transformation much more at scale, then actually the pandemic is accelerating a lot of the business activity that we're having and experiencing at the moment. Is that we're getting approached by banks from all over the world. Doesn't matter if it's tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Then I think everyone understands that you need to have access to technologies and you need to move much faster. And if the average market standard before COVID was that it used to take banks 24 months to deploy a technology, which is a staggering number, right? It's a killer number for startups, but it's even much of a killer number for financial institutions. We think and we see that going forward after COVID-19, we can reduce significantly those numbers by adapting to a world in which you need to plug and play with technologies. You need to experiment. You need to understand what's good for you as a bank, what fits your risk appetite, your business appetite, and then connect to the right technologies that you need to use in order to move forward with your business. And I think to some extent, COVID, at least for the floor, really highlighted the fact that the hunger for financial institutions is there. I think it just needed a little bit more of a push to move forward more with innovation and absorbing more of the great innovation that we have, not just in Israel, but I think in a lot of other countries as well. And I think it's a great phenomenon, alongside the fact that I think the pandemic has impacted a lot of countries. That includes also some of our clients, which are based in many of the European countries that have suffered the most. And that obviously naturally resulted in some type of a slow factor in moving with some of the initiatives and the projects that we've had until today. But I think slowly things are picking up, and we're seeing more and more banks are coming back to the kind of transformation agenda. And that's a good thing for us because we're able to accommodate and to answer the needs of those banks.
So exciting times. I think a big feature of this series that we've been running all the way through this pandemic has been looking at the sort of positives from the negative. It is very, very easy to look at this and be very doom and gloom about everything that's happened to the global economy. But I think at the same sort of stage, as you've brilliantly highlighted all the way through this conversation, is there are so many opportunities for us to do things better. And from everything you've just said about the sort of speed of innovation and the sort of bottlenecks and all the problems that we've seen that have stifled that innovation in just the pure procurement processes of major banks, there's a major upside here that I think it would be really remiss to go back to BAU and to lose the opportunities that we've gained from this. So from something so globally tragic, I think there is a absolute necessity for us to come out of this with a better and if the world's got a better financial infrastructure, I think we've got a much better world, full stop, as well from it. So look, I'm glad you're at the center of it all. Listen, there's so many so many brilliant bits of insight that you've added there, and I know that we could be talking for another hour about this and still come out with more as well. For people who want to reach out to you, Avi, and find out a little bit more about the floor and how you are providing this level of problem solving and innovation to financial institutions, what's the best way of them getting in touch with you?
First of all, our website, you can communicate with anyone from our team, but I'm a very much of a connector on LinkedIn. So anyone that wants to reach out can always connect with me on LinkedIn, and happy to take it forward.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much for that. Some exciting stuff happening with the floor as well. What are some of the things we should be looking out for?
So we're continuously growing our platform. We're going to be announcing a couple of interesting partnerships going forward that will increasingly enhance our capability to connect with any bank on one hand and any technology on the other hand. And that's something that is going to be very meaningful for banks, especially in an era when you can't fly and you can't meet with technology providers. You can find us basically as the alternative to mitigate that time in meanwhile.
Well, exciting stuff. Avi, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and hearing a little bit more about the floor today. Thanks so much for sharing the wisdom, and look, I hope that everything in Tel Aviv manages to get the cap back on the bottle and keep the numbers falling again. It's been so good to speak to you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon on another episode of Fintech Focus TV. Avi, thank you very much.